In this section, we're going to take a look at MetaShape. We'll go ahead and create a plane out here to emit from. We've got our TP already in the scene. We just want one. And let's go ahead and create a dynamic set. Let's use a generator. Let's create a matter waves. We'll pick the emitter that we want to use. And we're going to born into the all group. That's fine. Let's go ahead and switch to particles per second. Make their life, 3 is fine. And then in order to check kind of speed, we're going to come over to Master Dynamic, turn off Edit on the Fly, turn on Show Mesh. Now we go ahead and scrub and we can see those particles being born. Let's actually go ahead and we're going to randomize the emitters so they're not all kind of stacked orderly. Add some variation there. And then we'll come back up into the speed and we'll add variation into the speed. Then we're going to make a second rule. And we're going to go ahead and add our group. We want to affect the all group. We come over here to the operators, into shape, and use MetaShape. Make that connection. And now, as we come out here, you can see some very large, rough-looking mesh. Probably not your standard blob mesh resolution, but that's because our settings are, we're set to the viewport is set to a resolution of 16. So if we start decreasing that, of course, you can see that this becomes more fine. And of course, we're going to want the render resolution to match probably our viewport, or at least with the understanding that this is going to be almost twice as fine as this. And so you can see what this does is builds a procedural mesh based on the particles. And one of the things we want to look at is the size here that can be specified. This will automatically assign a size to these particles and use it to control how the blob mesh is formed. There's also the tension, and less tension will allow it to kind of relax and grow larger. And more tension, of course, is going to pull it tighter, more tense. The other thing, there's variation we can add to that tension. So some areas will be more lax than others. Let's take a look at these switches down here. We've got relative coarseness. Relative coarseness, when we turn that on, we're going to turn on the mesh here. What happens is it corresponds to the size of the particles here. So that as the particle size increases, the mesh evaluation becomes larger, or the faces will be larger. And so as we decrease the particle size, it's going to, you can't see it too well on there. And there's also now, it almost works as a second variable. As we increase the viewport resolution, as it goes higher now, then we get a finer mesh. So as we increase the size again, of course, we get a larger mesh because relative coarseness is on. As we decrease the size, we get a finer mesh. Anyway, we'll go ahead and switch that off, and we'll increase their size a little bit, decrease the viewport to increase resolution. And let's actually take a look at what use mesh does. Use mesh will actually use the particles mesh. You know what, let's turn off the show mesh for now. Let's say each of these particles had a mesh assigned to it. The use mesh switch would actually use that mesh, each of the vertices of that mesh, to kind of define the shape and use it to evaluate that MetaShape. We'll create a really wild example of this. We're going to go ahead and just hack out some geometry. We're going to create a spline. We'll make it renderable. Increase its thickness. Yeah, it's a little too fine for us right now, but let's see. There we go. Okay. Sides. Let's give it 8 sides. And we'll go ahead and throw oops. That's not quite what I wanted. Let's do this. Let's make it an editable poly, and kind of just alter his shape a little bit here and decrease that. Okay, and now what we'll do is come back in here on the matter waves. So when the particle's born, we're going to assign a shape, a geom instance, and we're going to pick that source shape we had. We're going to go ahead and disable this MetaShape rule. Let's actually rename that MetaShape for right now. And we'll go back, and this time we're going to turn on Edit on the Fly. This will allow us to control when TP updates. So we're starting to get a little complex. We don't want to get bogged down if it ends up being super complex. So we'll go ahead and turn on Show Mesh. And now you can see as these particles are born, we now see the source geometry that we had there. They're a little bit too large, so there's a couple different ways we could adjust that. We could either use the normalized size, and now of course we want Edit on the Fly off so that we can see that change. But we can modify it like this, or we could also add a size operator, and this will allow us to override whatever size value is in here. And it's important to remember too that here in the evaluation tree, size is below or comes after geom instance, so it gets evaluated after geom instance does. Okay, so we'll increase that. We'll give them some particle variation, size variation. And we don't really want them emitting like this. The reason they're doing that is because their source object pivot is located that direction. Let's try one thing first. We'll go ahead and modify the source object pivot. Has no effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an alignment, and we will rotate the particles. We don't want them set to random. We're going to say user defined, and let's see what happens when they come out here a little bit. Let's go ahead and modify them. Actually, you know what? We don't want to use the axis. Let's put the Z out there, but we actually want to use the rotation. Okay, we'll do this, and we'll put some variation in there. And now let's get back to business. Let's come back and enable the MetaShape. And in the MetaShape, we're going to say use mesh. And what we'll see here at first is not very much. That is partly because our settings need to be adjusted. And you can see the processing here is quite a bit slower than before. Increase this. We have to wait a moment. And what this is doing is you can kind of see it there. These formations that are starting to appear. Let's actually decrease our viewport render resolution to get a finer mesh.